have, throughout the day, encountered both of them, and in some ways their work so long precedes them, but I want to just say a word about each of them. Rinku Sen runs an organization called Race Forward. Many of you know Race Forward through a website, Color Lines. Many of you know Race Forward through the trainings that they do, not unlike the distilled version that some of you got to experience in her breakout session. But in a classic case of contagion, what many of you may not know is that just the ways that we in this country who are becoming more awake and aware about the future of America talk about race with more sensitivity, with more full body listening, with more awareness of intersectionality. These memes and frames of reference are things that either days, weeks, months, or years ago were first cultivated by the people at Race Forward. And so they've been shaping the way that we think and talk about these ideas of race for a good long time. And it's a real honor to have Rinku with us. And then, in many ways, my brother, the earliest first time we ever met, which was at an event, at the end of which we decided this was my brother from another mother. And that's saying something because, that's a fun, colloquial, familial thing to say. But Jose Antonio Vargas, as a prize-winning journalist, as a courageous activist, as somebody who came out as an undocumented American on the cover of Time magazine and the New York Times magazine, and who has been an activist creating organizations like Define American, and now an organization and a venture that we'll talk about in a moment, Emerging Us, has been envisioning and creating this new story of America for a good long time, but he's been doing so as somebody whose own hold or claim under law, whose own claim to this country is tenuous, who doesn't have the documents that I was alluding to earlier of United States citizenship. But the reason, and who has not seen his mother in a good long time because he can't leave the territory of the United States. Otherwise, he might not be able to ever come back in. And she's in the Philippines. And so when I call him my brother from another mother, I don't say that lightly because I get to see my mother. My mother's in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm going to see her in 2 weeks. I could Skype my mom like Jose Skypes his mom, but it's a different deal. And I think the idea of what it means to claim this country and to live like a citizen, I don't know anybody who lacks the papers and lives more like a citizen than Jose Antonio Vargas. So it's a great honor to have you on the stage, too. What we wanted to do here in this conversation really is, in a sense, to reflect and digest what we've been experiencing over the last couple of days. This overarching question that we've been asking of who is us is answered in part by us on stage, I suppose. But
we're Asian.
All Asians.
Everybody.
This is an Asian invasion of this conference. But it's answered in a different way as well, right? And I guess I want to just pose a common question to you both first, and then we'll just kind of flow more freely. And it's a very simple and broad question, which is, what does a new America look like to each of you?
Well, to me, it looks very, very multiracial. We use these broad racial categories: white, Asian, Black, Latino, Native American. But, where do the Persians fit? Where do the Arabs fit? Native Americans, oh my gosh, so many different identities and tribes. So the core identity of Americans as individuals and as small communities is just really, really diverse. It's really, there are huge differences in the ways that people actually live, in the cultures they follow, and yet there is a thread of humanity that we all want to achieve. And people really want some of the same things in life. They want to be able to develop their brains and their intellect. They want to be able to make art and be creative. They want to have a chance to play. And they want to do work that is meaningful to them. And they want to be able to spend time with their loved ones. So to me, it looks like a country in which you can actually be who you are, exactly who you are, but not have rewards and punishments be given out on the basis of who you are. And
or who you are not.
Or who you are not, exactly. And that removal of the reward and punishment based on an identity is the way that I imagine our future, the way I hope for our future to develop. Both parts are really important. You have to be able to be who you are, but then not have that count for rewards and punishments. You know, it's contradictory, but that's the contradiction, the paradox that I think we need to live into.
Another way to articulate rewards and punishments, of course, is power, right? And we've talked a lot over the course of these last 2 days about whiteness, about white privilege. Sometimes that conversation has been very blunt and provocative. Sometimes it's been a bit more philosophical. But what we haven't yet fully explored is just the ways in which the future of whiteness. And part of what I'm hearing you say, Rinku, is that maybe whiteness will continue to exist as a construct, but if it does, the main thing that you hope for is that whiteness will be delinked from power. That whiteness is not necessarily the seat
Right.
and source of original power in the country.
Right. I hope I'm not getting ahead of things here, but you and I were talking just before everything started, this plenary started, about how white identity changes and white identity is not static. And what I thought about while you were doing your video and I was sitting down was all identities change. No identity is static. We do a conference called Facing Race, and there was a moment at our last conference during the plenary where a woman named Key Jackson talked about how there's so much pressure on social media to pick your sexuality and then to stick to it. So people want to know, like, are you gay? Are you bi? Are you straight? What are you? And they don't expect you ever to change that. And she was saying that, you know, we have the right to change our sexuality and to treat our sexuality as fluid. Well, I think we have the right to treat our racial identities and our cultural identities also as fluid, and that it's a real mistake to imagine that the kind of Indian immigrant I was 20 years ago is the same kind of Indian immigrant I am today. The whole world of Indian immigrants to the U.S. has changed because of the numbers of people who are here now who were not here in 1972 when we arrived. So I think really trying not to attach too hard to our current racial identities, even while we fight for respect for those identities, that requires a kind of walking this tightrope inside ourselves, but we can do it. We're strong enough. We have the emotional intelligence to do that. But it means that you have to stay open and you can't attach too hard, even to who you think you are at this very moment.
So Jose, when I ask what does a new America look like, I mean, part of the answer is literally in the content and work that you're creating at Emerging Us. But I imagine there's a broader, more philosophical answer too in your heart.
By the way, I've never been on the same stage with two of these people before, and in many ways I feel like all I've been doing in the past 5 years is catching up to what y'all have been doing for years and years. So I'm really honored to be here on the same stage with them, and can we just give Eric a round of applause for all the moderating? Sorry. I'm saying this, Eric, because Rinku and I were sitting over there preparing for this, and we're going like, he doesn't even really have notes. How is he doing this? So just as journalists, we're just telling you that. So to answer your question, you know, I have to say, by the way, and let me just preface what I'm about to say by this. I feel as if the Obama administration has deported more than 2 million people in the past 7 years, and I'm not one of them. I feel as if, because I have this privilege to do what I do, that I have to insist on being as truthful, right? And as fearless as I can possibly imagine to be, because I owe it to that privilege, right? So if I offend anybody, I'm sorry, but I'm just trying to keep it real for myself, right? So to me, when I think about a new America, I think of two things. One, I think of the fact that we in this country have never fully told our own history to each other. We have not fully told. What I mean by that is by just the very definition, we were talking about the collaboratory the other day. When we say, or when journalists say, or when politicians say, that we are a country of immigrants, right? If I'm black, or if I'm Native American, where do I fit in that nation of immigrants myth that we have going on, right? I came here forced. That was slave migration, right? The indigenous land, and Nikita has, from the very beginning, said that we are standing in indigenous land. I am here. I can almost hear the ghosts of Carlos Bolosan, the great Filipino writer who was kind of stuck in a world in which he wasn't really quite American, and he had to leave the Philippines, and he died here, buried here in Queen Anne Cemetery. He wrote a book called The Americas in the Heart, which people don't know too much about. But I feel as if we have not fully told our story to ourselves, right? And we are now arriving at a time that it is critical that we do that. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is this idea. I just made a film for MTV called White People this past summer. It's on YouTube. It aired. Great. Rush Limbaugh hated it. Sure.
I thought he loved it. I thought that was the whole thing.
He hated it. But what was so interesting for me about this is, to me, trying to decentralize whiteness is going to be one of the chief challenges that we face in this country and globally, right? The fact that the country, in America right now, from K to 12 in public schools, white students for the first time are in the minority, right? What does that look like? What does that mean? And how do we decentralize it without saying to white people, we care about you, it's great. It's just that you're not in the middle of the world anymore, right? It's not all about you anymore. For far too long, the stories we tell ourselves and of you is for you, us explaining ourselves to you. People of color, that is. That's why when I look at someone like Toni Morrison, and the work that she has done to literally reframe, right, what she calls it without the white gaze. So how do we do that now? And then what kind of work in this new America must we do so that we are having inclusive conversations? I was making the argument the other day that I think we are where we are when we talk about race, immigration, and identity in this country because our conversations are far too comfortable. Especially progressives, I think. We pat ourselves in the back. Oh, we have acronyms for this. It's called microaggressions, triggering. I gotta tell you, I spent a lot of time in Arkansas and Mississippi. Nobody knows what white privilege is. Poor white people, they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. You're the ones that took our jobs. So how do we now have this conversation together? And I have to say one more thing about this. This is the only place, I have to say, Eric, this is why I'm so proud of you, man. Like, this is one of those few places in the country, maybe in the world, that we're having this kind of conversation. So.
Well, thank you, Jose. And I want to... You get three Asian Americans on stage and you start praising us too much, one of us is just going to go run away and hide,
That's totally true.
This is really embarrassing. So tell us, Jose, what you've just set up here, storytelling that is not either, that does not originate from nor is directed to a white gaze. Is sort of one way to describe this new venture, #Emerging Us, right? So tell us about what that is and what you're trying to do.
So what I'm trying to do is basically disrupt journalism. I would argue that when it comes to the demographic reality that we're now facing, in Los Angeles where I live, 72% of all women in Los Angeles are women of color. In Los Angeles. Doesn't that give the whole Oscar so white a whole different kind of conversation? In California, where I grew up, 51% of all Californians aged 25 and under is Latino, right? So this country is only gonna get gayer. By the way, I have to give really, is Dominique Devalier still here? There was this beautiful young person last night.
From the Mikva Challenge, yes.
Oh, it was amazing. She was talking, even I'm struggling with this right now. The language of gender fluidity, right? This idea that we don't even have the language right now for kids to identify who they are and how we have to create that and be respectful of what that is. So for me, we're only going to get gayer, blacker, browner, more Asian. Women of all races will break every barrier there is to break. So how do we tell this story, right? When still so many of these newsrooms are predominantly white, right? And I gotta tell you, if there were more Latinos in newsrooms, not Univision or Telemundo, if there were more Latinos in American newsrooms, the way we cover immigration in this country would be completely different. If we had more Asian journalists, right, and Rinku is one of the rarity. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of Asian American journalists who want to actually talk about immigration because they're afraid that if they say something, all of a sudden they're being political. I have heard this, I'm just going to out themselves, from the Asian American Journalism Association, who I can't get to work with us because for them, this issue is just too political.
You mean like a pigeonholing fear?
Pigeonholing fear. So how do we have the courage to insist on these conversations? And for me, Emerging Us is going to be that. And we decided instead of going to a venture capitalist, instead of going to another corporate company, I love corporations, I used to work for them, but hey, we got to start our own institutions. That the first thing we're going to do is crowdfund this. The first ever $1 million crowdfunding in the history of American journalism. And you'll check it out on Emerging Us. Please do check it out. We have 30 more days. And that's what we're doing. And I think we have a content to show. Kind of explain it a little bit.
A new chapter in American history has begun. The minority is becoming the majority. It's time to talk about us. All of us. Help us tell America's story.
That's beautiful. And the website is?
Emergingus.com. Emergingus.com. Please check it out.
So Jose was sheepish about overplugging it, so I will take over and plug it. One of the things we want to depart with at this conference is just things that we can do, right? And among the things that we can do on these questions of race and American identity and their intersection with our notions of citizenship, number one, do you have a subscription or is it just?
You can just sign up on our list, colorlines.com and raceforward.org, and you'll get access to all of our content, and it's free, except when we ask you for money, and you'll want to give.
And the second is to go over to emergingus.com and actually join this crowdfunding campaign. Because I think the power and the beauty of this is not just that it's crowdfunded and that it's to use the name of one of our wonderful workshops led by families I want to talk about in just a moment, the peer effect. It's not just the peer effect of mobilizing resources to create this kind of independent media venture, but the more of us literally have a stake in this, the better, right? I want to have an ownership stake in the storytelling of the future. I want to have an ownership stake in the next ventures that are going to be mass medium images and narratives about who is us and who we are and who we be, right?
Who we be, yes.
Who we be, to cite Jeff Chang's book. And so, I think that this ownership stake is something I want to actually go back to in the context of privilege. Because, Jose, when you just said a moment ago, I mean, for whatever reasons that probably in some ways have to do with your fame, you have not been deported. Right? That it might cause the officials too much problems or controversy if you did get deported, right? And
actually, what happened was, as you know, because Eric was one of the first people to contact me, I got arrested in Texas 2 summers ago during the Central American refugee crisis. I went out there to film. They arrested me at the airport. I was detained for 8 hours. Now, mind you, really what they should have done was deport me, although the Philippine ambassador had to call them to tell them that I am not Mexican. Because apparently if you're Mexican, if they arrest you at the border, they can just drop you off at the desert, right? And mind you, they take your phone away when you get arrested. They took your phone and your shoelaces and your belt, right? And I didn't know until I got out that it was breaking news on CNN that I got arrested while I was in a jail cell with these kids. They put me in the same cell as the little boys that crossed. And I kept thinking the whole time I got arrested, people get arrested all the time. I mean, here in the state of Washington, you guys don't have driver's licenses anymore for undocumented people. I'm sure somebody's driving right now and getting arrested and pulled over. Before you know it, they're in detention. They don't get breaking news. So the privilege of that, right? And how uncomfortable that must have been for the White House to try to figure out, okay, what are we gonna do? Let him get in there, or what do we do? So they got me out. I don't know who got me out. They got me out. Somebody got me out. And just dealing with that privilege, so I have to make sure that I'm constantly aware of that.
But can I say something about this, actually? Because we tracked, there's a whole movement of deportation defense in this country. Years ago, I was here, actually in Seattle, and I had a book out, The Accidental American. We had done a book talk, me and my co-author, and it was at Powell's, and all during our talk, there was this young man who walked back and forth behind the audience of our talk, and after it was over, he came up to me, this was like 2009, and he said, can I ask you a question? I heard the things you were talking about, and it seems like you're talking about immigration, and he whispered, I'm illegal. He whispered it, and he said, is there anything I can do? Do you think, he had just gotten out of high school, he couldn't go to college, he couldn't get a job, he was browsing the architecture books, the art books, because he wanted to be an architect. And he said, do you think I should turn myself in and beg for mercy? And I said, no. I think you should join an organization that's fighting for people who are about to be deported. So the key to not getting deported is, fame helps, it didn't hurt, but the key actually is coming out and being with other people and building a support base around yourself. So ending the isolation of being a deportable person that nobody knows about, and the shame of that by revealing and by working with other people to get help.
Unfortunately, so the Fight American actually started a coming out campaign in the same way that the LGBT rights movement was powered by people coming out. How can we get more undocumented people to come out? But I'm even uncomfortable with this whole idea of fame, right? Because
famous people are always uncomfortable with fame.
but people we're hearing right now about the deportation rates that are still happening. By the way, one of the hashtags you should follow is not one more. Not one more. It's that if you go on Twitter, at any point, someone is getting deported somewhere, and someone's building a campaign all around that. So, but this is, by the way, one of those things that I'm still amazed that, we have the first African-American president who has overseen the largest expansion of LGBT rights, who has also overseen the largest detention and deportation of immigrants in this country. Where's James Fallows? That to me is a really, really fascinating way to look at where we are right now.
One of the things that is so striking about what you both have said, Rinku, when you describe this, yes, fame is helpful if you have that, but the other is actually coming out and being with others, getting out of that isolation, right? This, of course, is extendable to every dimension of civic life, right? And one of the challenges that we face right now in the United States is several decades of a set of systems, economic systems, media systems, cultural systems, political systems, that have led us to believe that we live in isolation. Sometimes they try to sell that isolation as splendid isolation, and I'm autonomous, and I get to do exactly what I want. But other times, it's a very painful isolation, right? And I think one of the things that, whether the issue is literally undocumented friends, neighbors, coworkers deciding collectively to come out, or whether it's people on any other issue, people who have too long and too silently borne the poor quality of water, the poor quality of schools, the poor quality of policing, the poor quality of government institutions generally where they live, deciding, hey, I don't live in isolation. What Abdul was saying on the panel a moment ago is recognizing that these aren't random ones and twos, that they are part of a web and a system, and if that we actually decide, perhaps powered by social media, but maybe powered by old-fashioned knock on the door of the person who lives next to you, and realize that you are not alone, right? I think that is at least as powerful a dimension. The note that I wanted to come back to, though, on privilege is this. Yes, there is, in a sense, there's a certain kind of privilege that, Jose, you have, but there's a certain kind of privilege. I guess what I want to say is this. A lot of our conversation today has been one where the word privilege only got spoken in connection with whiteness. And I think it's really important for us, before we close this conversation, to recognize not only all the other forms of privilege. I have male privilege. I have the education privilege that I have, whatever. But to, again, in a way that is deeply humanizing for everybody to actually take a little inventory of what are the ways in which I am at least relatively privileged to have voice, to have or to not have my body and my identity canceled out in public, right? And I want to hear a word from each of you here in closing about how you want to counsel all of us here when we exit this room, how we deal with the different forms of privilege that we bear and we maybe not even have been willing to acknowledge because it's more comfortable to keep that privilege at a distance.
Yeah, there are two things I want to say. One is you talked about having an ownership stake in the forms of media and storytelling that we have. And you don't have to give to Color Lines or Emerging Us to have that ownership stake. You can make your own media, as all of you can. You can just own your own media and make it. And if you're going to be telling stories about your lives, then the thing I would ask you to do is to connect the lives of individuals, whether that's yours or another individual whose story you're telling, to the rules of the society, to policies and practices, to institutions, so that we can undo this myth that we're all standing here by ourselves and the only thing that influences what our lives are like is our own actions. That's crap, of course, but you have to actually explore the real tissue, the connective tissue between me as an individual and all of the people around me and the institutions that really shape my life. And the one thing I'll say about privilege is we all have it in a racial hierarchy like the one in the United States. Asian Americans in particular have a real deep questioning that we need to do about our positioning in that hierarchy and whether we're going to just accept what's given to us as honorary whiteness to keep everybody else under control, or we're going to bust through and reject that honorary whiteness and say, we are who we are, and we're going to, from this position, we're going to undo the racial hierarchy and undo white supremacy. But if you have some form of privilege, the most moving thing I ever heard was Bernice Johnson Reagan, who is a stalwart of the civil rights movement and a great, hugely inspiring activist and artist, and she said, if you have some privilege, risk it. If you have some privilege and there's something that needs to get done, risk it. And that's what I think we have to look into our own hearts and souls for, is for what am I willing to risk it? For whom am I willing to risk it? And then to go ahead and actually risk it.
Jose, the final word.
Eric and I share a dear friend, my best friend Jake Brewer, who passed away last fall. He would be here if he were alive because he loved this conference. And when he and I would get into these arguments about citizenship, not arguments, but how do we define citizenship? And the way I've always defined it is by my oracle, that is James Baldwin. James Baldwin, if you don't know who he is, look him up. This idea of bearing witness to someone's life. This idea that I can't talk to you about being undocumented, I can't talk to you about immigrant rights and not connect it to LGBTQ rights and Black Lives Matter and women's rights and income inequality. And all of these issues are interconnected because our lives are connected, right? I think of him as I was, this conference with Alicia Garza opening this last night, all I could think of was this quote. And Baldwin wrote this in the 60s when America was 85% white and 10% Black, right? This is from a book that he wrote. He said, everything now we must assume is in our hands. We don't have a right to assume otherwise. And if we, and I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious Blacks and Asians and Latinos and mixed race people, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able to end, handful that we are, this racial nightmare, and change the history of the world. If we do not risk everything, the fulfillment of the prophecy written in the Bible in songs by former slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, fire next time. I think that's where we are.
Please join me in thanking the prophesying, the compassionate, the powerful Rinku Sen and Jose Antonio Vargas. Thank you.